My microphone isn't going to be projecting to you. It's only going to be the online participants here. But can you all hear me okay now at this level? Okay. So so yeah, the oaks of West Texas have been kind of an obsession for me forever. I've been coming out here since I was, well, my first trip out in Big Bend was when I was 5, and I just remember every little bit of it. It just had such a huge impact on me at age 5, and my family never came out again until, well, we never came out again. And the first year when I was 16, I got my first vehicle, and I saved up my money. This was the first place I wanted to come, was the Big Bend region, just to go hiking again and just explore. And I've been coming ever since, from Florida, where I used to live, until finally I got to move to Texas and was a little bit closer to come enjoy them more frequently. But of course, you can look in the tree books and things of West Texas and get all the nice oaks all laid out in there. And of course, you get out in the field and you expect everything to match the books. And of course, it doesn't. I mean, oaks have a reputation everywhere with being a mess. But of all the places I've been in the world and looking at oaks, the Trans-Pecos is definitely the biggest mess I've ever seen. Oaks hybridize, we all know that probably. They're very promiscuous, but you just don't find the level of perceived hybridization, if that's what's happening here, as you do in really the Chisos here. Probably you do in some places in Mexico. I haven't really explored that yet, but I mean, with this array that we're having our opening screen here, some people could interpret this as 2 species. Some people can interpret this as 3 species, and some people can maybe get 4, and who knows, some crazy people may even see more in this here. I would lean towards 2 species, and it's going to be interesting to see what the DNA work that we've been working on that Michael spoke of is really going to tell us, if it can tell us anything. We don't really know how easily these are all going to be separable. So it's really kind of a mess here. So basically, stepping back, oaks are a member of the family Fagaceae, which includes a number of things. People are often surprised when I tell them that basically chestnuts are related to oaks, beeches are related to oaks. They're all in the same family. There's a bunch of Asian genera, Castanopsis, Lithocarpus, and there's some that are in northern South America, the Trigonobalaenus. But the one thing they all have in common is basically a nut that's encased to some degree in a cupule. And for some, it's taken to the extreme, like at Lithocarpus, there's actually an acorn inside of there. In the lower left side of the screen there. But that's actually made for gnawing animals to actually eat through and expose that seed for it to be able to germinate. It's never, if that drops on that big mass there of 3 fused nuts inside that hard shell, just drops on the ground, it's just never going to germinate unless animals actually chew on it. There's other species like the Castanopsis here that look a little bit more like an acorn with this kind of cupule. It's like a kind of like a paired shell that just kind of splits open as the seed matures, and will drop the seeds, not reliant on animals actually dispersing them. And then chestnuts, Castanea, they have that kind of spiky shell over it, the cupule, which is basically similar to the acorn cap that you see in regular acorns. But acorns have a wide diversity of forms. I was lucky to see the one in the upper left there, Quercus pachylloma in Taiwan. Basically that cap kind of flares out and is ruffled to certain degrees and is fuzzy too. It's kind of has like a felt-like texture to it. Really unusual. A lot of people think the bur oak, the one in the lower right, is the largest acorn, but really the one on the upper right here, the Quercus insignis, is the largest acorn in the world, from Mexico down into Central America. And that acorn there is actually about average size. They can get actually bigger than that. And they look even more impressive when they have the cap, the cupule on it as well. But in Asia, they have some that have what are called the ring cup oaks. They have concentric rings on the caps and all sorts of different forms. Most of the ones in West Texas, though, were pretty standard looking. And if you've been out hiking, you may have seen some of these granary trees. Acorns are extremely important for wildlife, especially late in the year. So many different animals eat these things, of course. And the acorns or the acorn woodpeckers are famous for making these trees where they're stashing all these seeds all over the place. But, and they've been important with people too. If you've been out hiking and seen these features in the rocks here, these are basically called cupules too, just like the actual cupule on the acorn. I mean, the name one isn't derived from the other there, but cupule just basically means kind of like a small cup-like structure. But these were basically made for processing acorns and nuts and grains and things, basically pounding them and grinding them into these holes that would just get worn deeper over time. So we know people were definitely using these, of course. And so focusing down in Texas, I mean, Quercus in the United States, you can see this is kind of a range of where you can find them. It doesn't stop at the Canadian border. They do spill over in the north. And of course, they do continue down into Mexico. But this is just all US county records. And I'm sure even though these dark green spots, which indicate no oaks present, I'm sure we can go to some of those counties in Texas and fill in the gaps too. It's just based only on herbarium specimens rather than actual observations. So you can kind of see they're all over the place, but in Texas especially, we have basically 50 of the 90 species found in the United States. And so we have the highest rate of species in the country per our state. I mean, I don't really like looking at things with political borders because a lot of these things do spill over into Mexico. A lot of these things we're kind of at the northern limit of where these where they range, just barely getting over the border. But if you want to look at it from that standpoint, it's, I guess, something to be proud of. And but yeah, you can see Mexico. I have there. It has 160 to 200 species. There are so many species that are left to be described in Mexico. So this is just kind of an estimate. And
Mostly in northern Mexico?
Oh no, all throughout it. I mean, oaks will go all the way down into northern South America. Oh, yeah, yeah. There's actually most oak species are in the tropics. So a lot of people don't think of that, but and a lot of them don't really even look like oaks when you get down there. So I've been mentioning just how difficult they are. I mean, many of you may have even been out there and just been totally confused at what you're looking at and things not matching the field guides. Really, I mean, just tips for attempting to make sense of it. I mean, first one I think is always the most important. Just embrace complexes. Things are not going to be straightforward in nature. Everybody wants them to be. Everybody wants everything to fit into a nice category. Nature is not going to work that way. These things are exchanging genes all over the place. Some of these things may stabilize over time and become more concrete in appearance, but at least in our lifetime here, there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of mixing and matching going on, and or we may just have really variable species. We're just kind of interpreting this as hybridization in terms of all the different variation we're seeing, but things are variable too. I mean, look at everybody here. Do you all look alike? Otherwise, I mean, like I've been doing, familiarize yourself with what's out there. Just keep looking at things. You can use the books and guides as a reference, but find all those things that are weird and stand out and try to see where they fit in, if they're intermediate between some of the things you're seeing in the books. Kind of just understand the big picture out there. You'll get more confused the more you do it, but that's a good thing. That's getting back to that complex. Again, don't rely on species descriptions. They almost never work in the field. You can definitely find species that do match that, but basically those scientific descriptions, when a species is described, that's only as good as the number of samples that that botanist really looked at. I mean, if you keep looking more and more, you can find so much variation that deviates away from all those parameters there. Also, just talk to others who have also been looking at these things. My mind gets changed all the time if like someone else has focused on a particular species that maybe I haven't had as much experience with, and they take the time to show me what they've been seeing over the years too. May not agree. There are some people with some what I consider crazy ideas out there, and there's probably people who think I'm crazy with some of my thoughts. And again, when it comes down to it, it is really all our interpretation until we have more concrete like DNA data and things to really kind of solidify all these theories that we have. And which gets us back to watching for updates as far as the current molecular studies that are going on. Because hopefully we will make more sense of this, but I don't think it's going to be just a nice straightforward set of results here. And then to narrow it down further, you all probably know there's red oaks and white oaks, or we'll go over the differences between those if you don't know in a second. So being able to identify those in the field is definitely a good thing. Out here especially, you can really narrow down your possibilities if you know your geology. Some things will only be grown on limestone, other things will only be growing on like the igneous rocks up in the mountains. Or places like in the Chistos, like on Laguna Meadows, you get some of the more limestone patches up there, which then harbor these isolated populations of oaks up there. A lot of people don't realize that there are some kind of uplifted limestone patches up there. They just think that the entire Chistos is the igneous rhyolitic soils, but there's definitely some geologic variation up there. And of course, like sand dunes, like up at Monaghan's, basically the only oak you're going to find there is going to be the little rhizomaceous Quercus havardii. You won't find that outside of those real deep, loose sandy deposits. Get to know what is the known ranges of these things. Again, some of these things have very limited ranges in the Trans-Pecos. So if you find something somewhere else that would obviously be of importance and folks would want to know. Otherwise, you can sometimes rule out if it doesn't quite match something. You can at least have that knowledge to be able to understand what's in front of you there. And then just get to know the distinct, unmistakable species. I mean, you can rule those out pretty instantly, but you can also kind of see the features that those have if you're seeing kind of intermediate plants in the field. It sounds like I'm getting everybody more confused as I go here, but it's really not. If you just really try to, you're not just gonna be an expert. I'm not an expert, and I've been doing this for years. Nobody really is an expert, but it's really just to help you kind of know what you're looking at here, rather than your mind just turning to mush when you get out there. You can narrow things down between whether they're tending to be larger trees versus shrubs, and then also just kind of that feature of them being either rhizomaceous, kind of spreading, kind of suckering, versus just a single trunk solitary plant. There are definitely exceptions there, and like some solitary plants, if they experience a fire and burn to the ground, sometimes they may come back multi-stems. So you have to be able to know what you're looking at. But going back to the habitat preferences, I mean, a lot of the mountains around here, you can find oaks kind of in these more open expanses, but generally they're going to be down in these little protected moist canyons. That's where you're going to get most of your species diversity, especially some of the north-facing canyons, or just some of the ones that are sheltered during portions of the day where they're not in full blasting sun, and keeps just those localized conditions a lot cooler than the surroundings there, and will retain just more moisture after the infrequent rains you get out here. So this is, some of you may recognize that. That's basically Cattail Canyon with Cattail Falls right down in there. And basically most of these trees that you see along the stream down here are oaks. Most of the plants that you see up here are not oaks at all, except for sometimes up in these little, up against these, up against the cliffs there. So these things aren't everywhere. You need to kind of hike to some of them. You can't just go on any trail in Big Bend and just be able to see all the oak species that have been recorded in the Chisos. This is from a ranch just north of town, the Chisos. You can tell it's a very dry area, but down this low area, most of those are oaks. There's a few other tree species mixed in. And yeah, you just get these little oases basically that are situated where there's either like spring upwellings or just any source of persistent water. Already mentioned the dune fields that are out here with the deep sands. This is up near, well, I think this is Monahans actually, but there are other areas throughout West Texas. And again, all the dark areas you see here, that's all Quercus havardii, one of the little rhizomaceous oaks, the only oak you will find there. So getting down to identifying white oaks versus red oaks. I mean, if you look online or look in any books, basically they're going to tell you that one of the more outward features is white oaks have kind of smooth, rounded edges, whereas red oaks oftentimes are lobed and have these awns or bristle tips, they're called. Basically these little points extending up from the tips of the leaves here, which can work with some species, especially a lot of eastern species, but what about this here? Anybody want to guess how many red oaks and white oaks are represented here beyond Kelsey, since she knows? Well. So these are all basically, even though looking at the previous slide, you can see all the pointy ones are tended to be the red oaks. Here, they're all white oaks. And so even though we got some really pointy lobes on some of these plants here, they actually don't technically have that little bristle tip. It's coming to a tip, but if this were a red oak, there would actually be a further extension beyond these points here. So we got Quercus lacei, Quercus pungens, and Quercus hinklei here. And so you can find out in West Texas a lot of pointy oaks that don't necessarily have that bristle tip that are white oaks. I mean, there are other features too that distinguish them, but in the field, in fact, there's a better kind of close up between a red oak. You can see kind of, it comes to a point, but has that little awn at the tip there, whereas, I don't know, it could be easy to interpret this little projection here as an awn, but it really will be that consistent diameter all the way to the tip there. Also with the, I mean, beyond the leaves, I mean, it's hard to really tell in the field if you have acorns, but you can tell by the acorn features, you can tell by the bark sometimes. It's one of those things you need to really get out in the field to look at. But if you're just out there briefly, oftentimes the leaves are the only thing you have to really go on beyond the bark. So we'll start with the white oak group. We'll get some easy ones out of the way, and then we'll get down to the ones that all look the same. So Quercus rugosa is one that I find easy. It's you're only going to find it in a few places, in Guadalupe's Davis Mountains and the Chisos Mountains. And there it's going to still be kind of in those higher elevations, kind of protected spots that harbor a little bit more moisture. The leaves on these are they're pretty large, and they're very thick, very heavy textured, very leathery. It gets the common name netleaf oak because if you flip the leaves over, it has this kind of nice, really beautiful network of venation, as well as a little bit of fuzziness, a little bit of pubescence underneath there. And the margins are oftentimes curled to a certain extent. Not all individuals will show that, but many of them will. But you know, just feeling the leaf, it's just very, very heavy texture, almost like cardboard. And this is something you see on some of the oaks here, where the acorns, this here's some developing ones here. They're basically, will be in clusters of maybe 2 to 3 to 4 on the ends of these very long stem-like peduncles here. And I found that some years, especially wetter years, you'll get plants making really long peduncles, and then some of the drier years, they'll be really short. So you can't really use that as a diagnostic feature. And there is also individual variability with that as well. Another one I think is easy, Quercus muhlenbergii. It's another one that's very sparingly found in West Texas. It's actually more common throughout Eastern North America. It's a deciduous species, unlike the previous species that we saw, which was evergreen. Gives you an idea of the range of Quercus muhlenbergii. You can see just very spotty county records out here. And just because a county is shaded doesn't mean it's everywhere in there. Oftentimes that's one little microsite within that county. But then kind of that weird range where you have these few down here and then everything's kind of up in the Midwestern states and get scattered records out into Florida and all the way up into New Hampshire there. It does continue down into Mexico as well. There are some people that look at our West Texas ones and the Mexican ones and think that they may be another species, or at least they see some morphological differences in it. They do look different from the ones further east, but it's one of those things that grow in both more humid easterly climates and drier western climates often may look a little different just based on the environmental conditions. It's not necessarily that they're different species. Another easy one, I think. Quercus the gamble oak, Quercus gambelii. It's only found up in the highest elevations in West Texas. So here you can see it like up in the upper elevations of Mount Livermore. There's some on Casa Grande at the very top there. Usually likes very exposed conditions. It's not as often seen in some of the more sheltered canyons, but it's the only white oak out here. It's got the large leaves that have these really nice, deeply lobed features on it. And it will sucker around. This is basically an entire stand of them up in the Davis Mountains here, where they will just produce root suckers around the original seedling that comes up. So you will get these colonies. And in fall, they'll turn yellow. So it's kind of easy to tell then. Getting a little bit more difficult. I mean, Quercus arizonica, we're going to start getting into some of the white oaks that just basically don't have any lobing or anything on them. So some of these are difficult when you really first start looking at them. And I've seen people interpret arizonica differently. There are different forms of it throughout the southwestern US. The ones we have here in Texas tend to look like this in their pure form, but this one will hybridize with other similar unlobed white oaks, and you get some weird intermediates going on. But this, I would say, is just a pretty typical form of Quercus arizonica. Here, you only really see it also in kind of these sheltered places, like there are individuals up in Boot Canyon that are scattered around, but and a few of the other sheltered canyons, but you definitely won't see it everywhere. And we've only seen a few really in the Davis Mountains, and it's become a little bit more common up in the Guadalupes. But once you get out in like Arizona and other places, obviously its namesake, they become very abundant features up in the mountains. And this one does have kind of heavy textured leaves. You can also see the venation on the underside is kind of approaching the netleaf oak that we saw earlier. It's got really prominently raised veins. It's got a little bit of a fuzziness to it. The top surface of the leaf has a really rough kind of sandpapery feel to it. And the leaves are just overall bigger in general than a lot of the other white oaks you can find out here that have just basically these simple ovate leaves here. This was taken in Boot Canyon, and I just thought that was a neat picture in fall with the evergreen kind of bluish cast of the leaves contrasting with the big tooth maple there. Quercus lacei, this is kind of a definitely not common out in Trans-Pecos here. We've got the records from Brewster and Terrell County there, but generally you're going to find it in the southern hill country, the southern Edwards Plateau there. There's only really a couple records out this way. There's one spot basically, as far as anybody knows, in Big Bend National Park, one little canyon where they're growing, and then one or two spots in just to the east in Terrell County. But if you haven't seen them in the hill country, they basically have kind of a color's not really coming through in this kind of washed out photo and this taken in the full sun, but they generally have a really nice kind of blue color to them. They're almost turquoise. There's a little better example of just kind of showing that blue coloration. You can find these different forms within a population, these the highly lobed ones like you saw on the previous slide, and then these unlobed ones. So makes it a little bit challenging. This appearance here may make it look a little bit like the Quercus arizonica that we saw in the previous slides. And then a relative of it that's out here that's a little bit more widespread, but it's still kind of spotty where you find it, Quercus oblongifolia. The leaves will be a lot smaller on this. You won't find any lobing on these. And generally it's found in kind of fairly exposed areas on limestone, but I have found it on the igneous soils too in some places. There's a number of populations on Big Bend Ranch State Park and around the Chinati Mountains, but I have seen it in Big Bend National Park, Davis Mountains, and becomes a lot more common the further west you go, like up in the Guadalupes. Really nice blue color to it when you encounter it in the field, as opposed to kind of like a silvery gray. Again, the colors aren't really coming through very well in these. It's hard to get photographs when things are always so washed out in the bright sunny conditions here in West Texas. But another way to kind of distinguish this from a lot of the white oaks here is the leaves have absolutely no tiny hairs on them. A lot of the other oaks, like the gray oaks, like Quercus gricia, and some of the other ones out here, this can be confused with. If you just take your fingernail and just kind of smudge the leaf, you'll make like a scrape in the hairs there that will that'll just make it apparent that there is kind of that thin layer of fuzz over the leaves. But these, you won't be able to detect any little hairs on those. It's just totally smooth. And speaking of the gray oak, Quercus gricia, this is one of the more common white oaks out here. It tends to like the igneous soils or rhyolite, basically, of the mountains of Big Bend and Davis Mountains and everywhere in between. Will grow both in the sheltered sites and also more exposed locations, but usually avoids the most dry areas. And in the more sheltered areas, it'll take on the form of a pretty big tree. In the more exposed areas, it will stay smaller. This is up a really nice specimen I've always been drawn to up at the Lawrence E. Woods, a little rest stop up in the Davis Mountains on the scenic loop up there by the Nature Conservancy. But yeah, it just always stands out with that kind of silvery color. It is a little bit variable. You can find some that are a little bit more green and some that even looks like white. It all depends on the density of the hairs on the leaves. When you look at the leaves, you can't really tell that there's hairs on there. But again, if you just take your fingernail and scratch it, you'll actually scratch those hairs off and it'll become really apparent. If you have a hand lens too, most people never do. I mean, you can really see them that way. But yeah, in comparison with a lot of the previous oaks we've seen, the leaves are just kind of shorter, a little bit broader, oftentimes have a little bit of a irregular heart-shaped leaf base to them, but not that that's only a feature with Quercus gricia, but generally it's one of those easier oaks to identify out here just due to its prevalence. A lot of you know that oaks tend to have galls on them due to gall wasps and other insects that, yeah.
So we had a request. Yeah. Did you also?
Yeah. Well, that's a problem is I just don't know a lot of common names, and what's a common name to some people is not a common name to another. Yeah, I think I did say that, but yeah, and that's one thing. A lot of people are scared of Latin names, but if you really want to, I've just always, I mean, I know common names sound easier, but Latin names really aren't that difficult. And once you really start getting into it, and just don't even worry about pronouncing them. That's the main thing. I found a lot of people that dealing with the pronunciation of Latin names is the big issue. Just learn to recognize them and learn to refer to them in the books. A lot of times the sources that you're going to want to be looking at aren't necessarily going to have common names, or it may not be the common name someone else told you it is. So it's kind of difficult sometimes, but a lot of people just think I'm just being like a snob or something, just using only Latin names, but it really does make things a lot easier. Not that there isn't confusion also with Latin names sometimes, but yeah, I'll try to remember to insert the common names when I can. But going back to the galls here, some species of gall insects, which basically kind of alter the growth of the plant. Basically, what the gall is actual tissue of the host plant that the insect manipulates in a way that it forms that structure that the insect lays its eggs in. Different gall insects basically will go to have their own species of oaks in some cases. And so it's kind of an emerging field where some people want to be able to identify all these different gall insects better for identification purposes of these oaks here. There are some gall insects that do go to multiple species, but then there's other ones very, very specific. So it's one of those things when I'm out collecting herbarium specimens, if there's galls, I want to collect those too, just so we have that preserved. And if someone wants to look at that downstream. So this is a gall here you can pretty commonly find on the Quercus grisea. It's very showy. Quercus depressipes, I don't actually know the common name of this. It's not a very common oak, at least in the US. There's only one known population at the very top of Mount Livermore, just right below Baldy Peak there. And that's it for the US populations. There are other more extensive populations down in Coahuila and I think some adjacent Mexican states, but we just have these maybe a couple dozen individuals up on the top of Mount Livermore, and that's it. And so it's been a conservation concern. I'll talk about later what we've been doing to kind of get these backed up in cultivation, but it's easy to mistake with the gray oak. It does superficially look similar. The leaves are pretty much the same shape. They tend to be a little bit greener, not as silver. To me, once I kind of learned what to look for, they kind of stick out to me. Just because, especially that greener, and also just kind of the branching habits a little bit different too, which is hard to really explain unless you really looked at a bunch of them. But they tend to have really nice red new growth. The gray oak can as well. But I've just always found it particularly striking in the Quercus depressipes. And this actually shows a little bit better the hairs on the leaves I was talking about earlier. So this is the gray oak, the Quercus grisea, and then this is Quercus depressipes. So you can see all those little spots on them. Those are little hairs on the leaf surface. And you can see them continuing on the stem too, on the twigs there. Whereas Quercus depressipes does not have any hairs at all. You can see some little spots there, but those are just kind of little imperfections or just the texture of the leaf there. It doesn't have any hairs on it at all, totally smooth twigs as well. So these do grow side by side up there on the top of Mount Livermore. And but that's one way of distinguishing them. It's just the lack of the hairs compared to the gray oak. And also one thing I noticed too, that when we've been up there in wintertime is after some good chilling, the Quercus depressipes takes on this really nice red venation. It's just kind of a response to that cold, whereas all the Quercus grisea around it were not exhibiting these features. It's really beautiful. Getting into some of the other ones, Quercus tumii, this is one that barely gets into Texas. You can see there's just that one county shaded there, near El Paso. These are only, in Texas, these are only found in the Franklin Mountains. That's basically, to date, the only place people have seen them. They could get into some of them more, a little bit more easterly, like around the Eagle Mountains or Quitman Mountains, maybe. But otherwise, that's as far as I go. Quercus chihuahuensis, this was one that, I don't know why that red line is there, but this is one that all the previous records had just basically said that in the US, it's only found in the Eagle Mountains and up at Hueco Tank State Park. But I don't know, the more I've been looking, I've been finding numerous individuals in Davis Mountains here. I've seen a couple in Big Bend National Park and down the Chenati Mountain area. So it is around. I think it's just one of those things that people have just interpreted as a weird gray oak. And common name on this, I guess we can call it a Chihuahua oak. I don't know. It's not common enough that I think anybody's really given it a common name, but it is definitely out there, just kind of mixed in with all these other white oaks here. What really makes it stand out to me is just the kind of ribbing on the leaf there between the secondary veins. The leaf is just kind of quilted, kind of puffed up between those, which really stands out. Usually has a fair degree of toothing on it as well. Definitely, even though it's pointy, it's not a red oak. It's definitely a white oak. It doesn't have those little awns on it. Some other photos just kind of showing that that just kind of rib texture to the leaf here, and just the overall shape too. Just tends to have these teeth towards the distal half of the leaf here. So it's just one of those cryptic oaks that's just kind of been hanging around, I think, more widespread than people have really realized. We already kind of talked about this one up at Monahan's, Quercus havardii, the what is the common name? Huh? What? What isn't it like something shinzoke, or maybe Havard shinzoke or chinook? Or again, we can't make up our names on common names. It's just easier to use Latin names. But yeah, it's a dominant oak up there in the deep sands, and the leaves are variable. Sometimes they may not be as lobed as these individuals are, but acorns are very large in proportion to the leaves and the plant itself. They can often be like silver dollar sized. Yeah, basically all those dark areas you see on those dunes there, that's all just colonies of suckering Quercus havardii. Really neat to see it in habitat. Oops. Get my previous photo, but oh well, it's basically Quercus moriana, Moor's oak, I think they call it. This one is a limestone specialist, so you will only find it in places like the Glass Mountains and other features both the east and west of here. It's a little suckering species as well. It tends to be shrubby, though in some areas you can find it growing as a small tree in areas that have a little bit more moisture. Leaves are highly variable. Some of them will be kind of curly. Other ones will be a little bit more flat, but all of them tend to be kind of bicolor, where the top surface is kind of like a blue-green color, and then the underside is very stark white, as you can see here, and very fuzzy. It's pretty distinctive if we put those two features together, limestone and just that kind of bicolor effect with the light color undersides and the kind of gray-green, blue-green upper surface. There's really no other oak you can mistake it for that has those features out in West Texas. Then one of my favorites, Quercus Hinkley oak. This one is basically only known from two sites in West Texas, one down near the town of Shafter, and then the other one in Big Bend Ranch State Park on the geologic feature called El Solitario. And it may be in Mexico and nobody's found it yet, but to date, those are the only known sites. And it's a really neat oak. We've already saw a picture of it earlier, the one that had all those kind of spiny holly-like leaves to it, but is still a red oak, or I'm sorry, a white oak. It does not have the awns, those bristles on the tips of the spines there. and tends to grow is kind of a little shrubby thing, really nice, attractive red new growth. You catch it just right. Acorns are basically larger than the leaves. But it's pretty much a typical size. So this is all one suckering plant that Dr. Martin Terry, if you know him, retired from Saul Ross, and Shannon Still, one of our collaborators from UC Davis, when we were out looking for acorns. These, yeah, they're just out there in these limestone areas, full exposure, just kind of hanging on there. These individual colonies are probably, who knows, hundreds of years old, maybe even older. They just keep slowly suckering out. I mean, the dry years, they just basically sit there. They get some rain, that'll kind of stimulate them to grow a little bit more. You can see a detail of the suckers originating off of this parent plant here. And those are what we kind of use for propagation. And a lot of the dry years, they just don't produce acorns. And so, and we also kind of value just backing up every single individual here, because each one has its own unique genetics. So we'll just take cuttings, these root cuttings off of each one. This is the population on El Solitario. Basically all these clumps going up that mountainside there are Quercus hinklei. And so this was kind of an interesting thing. I mentioned earlier about how some oaks will have their acorns on clusters on these long peduncles. I've noticed some years out here, especially the wetter summers, normally the oaks will flower in spring, and then the acorns will develop over the summer and will be mature by either August to September, October, depending on the species. But I've noticed some of the white oaks especially will flower normally in spring, and they'll have their acorns developing. And then sometimes if they get enough rain, there'll be a secondary flowering over the summertime. And it's usually a lot more vigorous. Normally Quercus hinklei only has just solitary acorns, like we saw in those previous photos. But here with these more vigorous flowerings and therefore fruitings, you get these peduncles. Each one of these is a little tiny juvenile acorn. I mean, if you look at the species description, this isn't, it's never been known to produce mature acorns on these big long peduncles in these clusters here. This was actually seen last August when we were out there, when we were basically collecting mature acorns from the typical spring flowering. And I'm sure these all basically aborted here. But the fact that it's actually doing that is one of those things that can kind of throw you off if you're using this as a feature for identification. Because there are some species that do more consistently have the acorns on these peduncles and clusters. So I think this is just a total fluke just based on the conditions that year. And so yeah, there's weird things going on. And the other thing that happens with the species, when it's grown in cultivation elsewhere with more water, richer soils, it'll actually turn into a tree. It won't stay that little low, pathetic, scrubby thing. These are some that are growing at San Antonio Botanic Garden, collected by Barton Warnock a long time ago. And they're about 18 feet tall or so, maybe a little bit bigger. They do still want to sucker. At San Antonio, they do actually kind of mow or weed eat down all those suckers that are constantly trying to come up from the root zone there and try to maintain it as just that single stem tree. So that does help push a lot of the energy into those couple stems and allows them to grow more. But a friend of mine up in Dallas also grows this from old Benny Simpson collection, and he lets it sucker, and it still has turned into a really large tree, and including the suckers. So it's not just a product of cutting off all those root suckers to make a single stemmed tree here. But basically, this kind of goes to show that a lot of the oaks that we see in West Texas, especially a lot of the rare ones that are very localized, they don't really want to be here anymore. They are basically, because it's well known that the Big Bend region used to be a lot wetter back in towards like the end of the Ice Age and thereafter, and it's just been drying ever since then, even before any human impacts on the earth. I mean, we're probably making it a lot worse now, but some of these plants are just kind of just barely hanging on. And it just goes to show, if you take some of these things and plant them in better conditions, they just kind of breathe a sigh of relief. And it was something I had to really convince we have our global conservation consortium for oaks, which we have collaborators all over the world that kind of work on our conservation targets. And we do both in situ as well as ex situ conservation work, getting things preserved outside of their habitat, either backed up in botanic gardens or other safe sites. But also there's obviously interest in thickening up the wild populations where possible. But with this one, I've been telling people they don't want to be here. We don't want, it's just going to be fruitless if we just keep planting more out into where you find them, if they're all just going to be fading out anyway. So it's better to get them backed up somewhere else. So some of these plants, I mean, things do naturally go extinct. I think people think nowadays that basically all extinctions are basically on us, and we're probably, again, helping accelerate the natural process of these things fading away as other more adaptable things come in. Which brings me to how these populations are also hybridizing with Quercus pungens, which is much more adaptable to these dry, open, exposed areas. There's Martin Terry again, and that large example there was proven by Janet Bax, who did work on Quercus hinklei and the hybridization down here in nature, that this one was proven to be a hybrid between these two species. So you can see when it gets this influx of genetics from this more adaptable plant, it'll suddenly start turning into more of a tree form here. And so some people think that's bad. We got to keep them pure and to the way we want to think of them as a species. But this is basically kind of speciation happening before us. This is getting new genetics mixed in with the Quercus hinklei, and we'll create maybe down the road the new embodiment of that species here. So
is the hybridization the plant's way of maybe further adapting it, a step toward staying where
absolutely.
it is?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, it's been interesting with a lot of these kind of relictual species where you only just find a few persisting colonies, not just in West Texas, but all over the world. They seem to be more apt to hybridize, more accepting of pollen from other individuals than like some of the more common species out there. So something may change to kind of as a survival tactic to just be able to
like
be accepting of other genetics.
Are always stronger than purebred dogs. Trees.
Yeah. But Quercus pungens, the one that does grow with hinklei, the one that I was just showing hybridized with it. This is what pungens looks like in its pure form sometimes. In the more moist sites, the leaves will be much longer. They can sometimes be like maybe 2 inches long or so, and will turn into large trees. But in the drier, more exposed sites, they can be low and scrubby, just like Quercus hinklei, and have very small leaves like hinklei, and maybe almost somewhat reminiscent of hinklei too. So it's one of those things too. It all depends on the environmental conditions, how some of these oaks may look, which adds to the confusion in identifying these guys. Quercus turbinella too can sometimes be mistaken for Quercus hinklei as well. Leaves tend to be a little bit hairier. You can actually see all the little hairs on the leaves there, but the toothing can be very similar. This species is actually very infrequent in West Texas. There are populations here and there around, and it does tend to like the more igneous soils as opposed to the limestone soil. So
species that are sort of, small population hidden away, are there birds or insects or whatever that depend on that particular species for their survival?
sometimes, I mean, yeah, with some of these species, I don't know that anybody's really looked close enough at all the interactions that.
It would just seem kind of logical that
Yeah.
a small group of non-plant.
Yeah, no, and many other similar analogs in the plant world. I mean, yeah, definitely. But it's just one of those understudied fields that that actually we keep learning more about, especially in the especially underground, and in terms of all these different things that are between the mycorrhizae and just all these other interrelations on a much smaller level than just the bigger animals and insects and things that you see above ground. So here's a kind of what I'd mentioned earlier about not trusting the species descriptions. And this is an example of one of the descriptions for Quercus carmenensis, one that's been recorded from West Texas sparingly, mostly, well, only up in the Chisos Mountains. And so you'll get all this jargon. If you hate Latin names, you'll hate the rest of the trying to make sense of a species description here. But I highlight a few key points just that are in the description. And this description is based off of Mexican individuals, where this species is more common. And so in green there, you can see they decide to put twigs, often strikingly red, and petiole, basically a little stem-like feature that attracts it to the leaf to the stem, usually strikingly red. As far as like all the individuals that seem to otherwise match the description of carmenensis, I've never seen red in them at all. And sometimes kind of like we saw the winter red color in the Quercus depressipes. I mean, the red may be a temporary thing, that maybe the botanists, when they were there that one time, it was displaying that red color. Some plants will turn flush kind of red if they're stressed during like a drought or other time. So I would say that's not a reliable feature. The one thing I have focused on, which seems pretty consistent with herbarium specimens of the species, so the secondary veins, so not you got the midrib and then you have the main kind of veins that branch off of those as the secondary veins. Oftentimes that's used to distinguish a lot of the white oaks out here. Is basically the vein count within, it'll give you a kind of a range. Like for this one, it's 9 to 12, which is a lot more than basically most of the white oaks that we have out here in West Texas. So like all your Grisea and all the other things that can kind of run together with that, they're generally going to be less than 9 by a long shot, usually more like 8 or so, 7 or 8. And here's kind of going back to those peduncles with the clusters of acorns I was mentioning on some of the other white oaks in blue here. Acorns solitary or paired, subsessile, meaning it's not on a peduncle like held close to the stem, or short pedunculed. So you get all these range of things that just ends up being, it could be anything. But then here on limestone, so that's another good thing that narrows it down. And so this was one of the few, there's a number of herbarium specimens like here at Sul Ross that are called carmenensis. I think are mostly hybrids. This is one of the few plants that I've seen that seems to really match, except for the red in the petioles, which would be these little structures here in the stems. But vein count, it's got it all there. The secondary veins coming out here. The pubescence on the top and the lower surface matches up really nicely, and it's a really distinctive oak, but very few and far between. That's an herbarium specimen of one of the type specimens, and matches up pretty good. You can see all the vein count there. Comparison, there is some, you can see there's occasionally some random lobes, which you can see here as well. And one of the plants is conveniently growing side by side with the gray oak, and you can tell just kind of, even though if these were both separated, I can see how they would be a little bit confusing, not looking at the veins or anything, but you can tell that there's definitely the way they're held, the carmenensis holds their leaves more kind of upright and everything, not just beyond the color here too. I would definitely not rely on the subtle color differences as the diagnostic feature, but You can really tell a lot from that photo. But a lot of the herbarium specimens that you find tend to be these kind of intermediate things that I think they're, it's just another one of those examples, kind of like with the Hinkley, where you have these kind of sparse populations and they're just kind of mixing rampantly with these other white oaks that are next to them. And you get all these different array of things, including things that just are kind of getting away from like some of the gray oaks or what some of the other parents. But like all these don't have the proper vein counts or anything, but still have kind of that look to it. And where you find the Carmenensis, you also find the Quercus intricata, but these are the two species that tend to be kind of localized to both high elevation and limestone. So here in West Texas, you'll only find these up in Laguna Meadows and up on Casa Grande, where there's a little bit of liminess to the soil, again, from that kind of uplifted remnants of the limestone that all that igneous material pushed up through. And so Quercus intricata is pretty distinctive when you see it. If you go up to Laguna Meadows, it's just all over the place. It's pretty much the dominant tree in kind of those grassland areas there. It's a little low shrubby thing. It can get about maybe 6 feet tall or so, but generally they're going to be lower. The leaves oftentimes have this kind of crinkled appearance that can have varying degrees of pubescence. There's a lot more variation, but you can kind of see it just has that really kind of ripply texture to it. Really neat oak. And it has these nice light colored fuzzy undersides. There's some more kind of hybrids, I think, between Carmenensis and intricata. Look very intermediate, but it's a guess. A couple things you're not likely to find unless you go into the very eastern portion of the Trans-Pecos. Quercus fusiformis, this is the live oak that's basically really abundant throughout the hill country, Edwards Plateau area, and just barely spills over into the Trans-Pecos around the Pecos River area. But it will get, live oaks do get planted out here too sometimes, so gotta take that into account. And fusiformis is kind of famous for producing these mottes, these little clusters of kind of sparsely suckers.
Are those plants separate underground, or do they?
These are all the same, that's the same individual. So they will usually start off as one dominant shoot, and then they'll produce a few root suckers that will eventually thicken up. Yeah, sparing. Some do it to higher degrees than others. It's kind of and some remain solitary. And there's still things out there that we need to kind of better characterize. We found this up in the Eagle Mountains, and it doesn't match closely any, I couldn't find my close-up of the leaves, but this doesn't match closely any species in West Texas. It was very distinct and very beautiful too. That's the white oaks. Run through the red oaks. We have much fewer of these out here, so we'll whiz through these real quick. Again, we'll get some of the easy ones out of the way. Quercus hypoleucoides is difficult to mistake. It's often called the silver leaf oak, even though it tends to be white rather than silver on the undersides here, with a contrasting green top to them. It is a red oak, even though it doesn't have any of the pointy projections on the leaves. At the very tip here, it still has that little bristle tip that you look for when you're looking at red oaks. Photos of it, it will turn into a large tree. In our area, really only find it up in the higher elevations of the Davis Mountains and then out in the Guadalupes, and then it becomes much more common in New Mexico and Arizona, and also down into Mexico. And up along the things which are perceived to be hybrids between Quercus gravesii, one of the other red oaks we'll talk about in a second, that many of you might know anyway, and hypoleucoides. So it's got the lobing like the gravesii, but it's got the kind of white hairs on the undersides too. But what I find weird about this hybrid is And so here's hypoleucoides, here's Graves' eye, and then here's the perceived intermediate. What's unusual about this is these hybrids on the top surface of the leaf here, this is the bottom, this is the top surface, have a really dense covering of hairs on it, which neither parent really have. Both of them will have some sparse hairs on it, but why they have such a dense amount of hairs on that top surface is just kind of interesting. Just another photo of the branches of the comparison. And here they're growing all together. So basically, this is the hybrid here. You can see how silver it looks with all those hairs on the top surface of the leaf. This tree right here is Quercus Gravesii, and then here's Hypoleucoides. So you got kind of all three nicely growing next to each other. So it's logical to think that those are hybrids, but we can't just assume that. So we'll have to see what if the DNA can prove that. But I have found in the Chisos some Gravesii that do have these high amounts of silver on them. So it's not common, but occasionally you can find some of these really striking examples of these kind of silver leafed Gravesii. You can tell here we're smudged a little bit of the hairs off and revealed the green underside. But Gravesii in itself is extremely plastic in terms of its shape. If we're assuming these are all the same thing, we kind of know that because we've grown these from seed and you can get similar variability from these, but whether or not we're seeing hybridization or just natural variability, we don't know. And complicating things is, again, depending on the year, depending on the rainfall amount, you can get leaves that look very different. So like on this example, these are the leaves from the previous season when there was more rain. And then in the droughty conditions, it's producing these little stunted leaves that are shorter and broader than in proportion to these more longer, narrower leaves that are produced in the wetter times. So often later in the season, this particular tree, when I revisited it, it dropped all these leaves and only had these little tiny leaves on it. So again, you can't just go on what you see in one particular season. And looking in the books, this was C.H. Muller who did a lot of the initial work on the oaks of West Texas and into Mexico. He obviously had his generalized photos here, where of course if you just try to match up things to these photos, everything would be wonderful. It worked that way, but it doesn't do that all the time, which gets us into Quercus graciliformis. This is one of those problematic ones where there's some that it all depends on the interpretation as far as what is graciliformis. Here in the Chisos, most people tend to kind of narrow down to these really kind of asymmetrically lobed, kind of long, narrow leaves, not really deeply cut or anything. These plants are up in like the Blue Creek Canyon area. But then you start getting into stuff like this. And if you ask some of the Mexican oak workers down there, they'll say that's what we call graciliformis. These more broader leaves, a little bit different than, almost looks like a Gravesii. It's been kind of stretched out a bit. And so you get all this kind of variation where some people may just call all this Gravesii. We really don't know what we're looking at. And then you get all these weird things. I've showed these photos to some of the Mexican colleagues down there, and they're like, oh yeah, that's definitely graciliformis. That's what we call it. That's what it looks like down here. And they say, what we have doesn't look like what you all have with those real narrow ones up there. And so it's one of those things where we may have two different species. We may have just all sorts of mixing and matching going on. We really don't know. And it all depends on who you ask. So, yeah. Not yet. It's that's the plan, but that's easier said than done, getting material from Mexico. We're hoping we can work with them on being able to do the molecular work down there, but it's the problem is getting funding to them as well from the US from our project. Unfortunately, they may have to find their own funding. there's just all sorts of politics involved in science, unfortunately, which gets in the way. So, but I mean, we have these representatives here in the US that kind of match these weather. I mean, they may be totally different things, even though they have the same appearance though, too. That's part of the confusion with all this. And you get examples like this where it depends on the leaf and how you want to interpret it. Some of those leaves may look like Quercus gravesii, and some of them may look more like Graciliformis. This is all one tree right there. So it's a total mess. Benny Simpson, if you have some of his books or heard of him, these are ones that he collected as Graciliformis. These are growing up in Dallas on some A&M property that unfortunately they don't want to preserve up there. They just want to destroy it to put more buildings up on campus. So I've been trying to get them propagated. There's just another example of two trees grown side by side where some of the people we were with wanted to call that gravesii and this Graciliformis, but again, where you want to draw the line. And then Mahler also named this kind of form of Graciliformis too, just to complicate things more. I've never seen anything like this. I don't know, Michael or Kelsey or anybody have seen anything more resembling what he called Graciliformis parvilobata. It looks kind of interesting. Be neat to find again. And then the mythical Quercus robust, or no, I'm sorry. Well, this one's kind of a problematic too. I don't think this is a good species, but I'm willing to be proven wrong by the DNA here. I think this is, again, part of this whole range of forms that we're seeing here between all these red oaks. And even Mahler, who described the species, Quercus robusta, we'll see some photos in a second. The main thing I wanted to look at below the description here was how he went back and forth even on whether or not it was a hybrid or a good species. So he named it. He later thought that it may be a hybrid between Emeryii and gravesii, and then later on he then went back on that again. So it happens to everybody. Yes.
So you were talking, maybe I missed it, but have you already talked about the area?
We're going to be getting to that. Mhm.
Because we have, we're in the Louisville.
Nice.
So that's where we don't know what we think.
Yeah, probably. They're pretty common out here. But yeah, we'll get to that in a second. But yeah, this is one of the types of Robusta, but some of the other subsequent collections of Robusta have all been kind of getting away from this general appearance. Some people might interpret this as Graciliformis. This is one living tree that people kind of agree is Robusta, but others like me think this is kind of like a nice intermediate between gravesii or Graciliformis complex and Quercus emeryii that we were just talking about. And so these leaves right here would be kind of typical leaves of emeryii. There are highly variable though. You can find emeryii that don't have these toothy margins on them. But generally they're going to have some degree of toothing. And then this is what some people interpret as Robusta. Acorns are basically identical. So you can't really go off of any descriptions of those. And they're, I think I have another photo. Yeah, so this is a photo that I was on my opening slide here. So basically I kind of agree those first three are emeryii. And these would be more on the gravesii, Graciliformis spectrum. And then those two are what are being considered the Robusta, and then some stuff in between. So people want to categorize things. So I think it may just be better to look at the big picture, and some people will feel better if it has a name slapped on it. I just, whoops, glossed over the Quercus emeryii, but yeah, Quercus emeryii is just one of the more common oaks out here on the igneous soil. You can see a lot of the big specimens up in the Davis Mountains here. Ones in the Chisos tend to be a little bit smaller, tend to be in more open areas. But yeah, it's basically kind of like a analog to the live oaks that you see in Central Texas. They will on suitable sites form these really nice big trees, like you say, and where there's a little bit of subsurface moisture, and really attractive plants. I think should be grown a bit more. They looked a little, I've heard some nurserymen say that they just look too scraggly when they're young, but that's exactly how a live oak looks too for people that are in Eastern US when they're planting all these scraggly oaks and parking lot medians and things. But we get to the mythical tardifolia. This is one that may be extinct in the wild, we don't know. There was only one known specimen remaining up until the early 2000s that has since died up by Boot Spring. And for the longest time, I never got to see the original specimen, the original.
And the batteries, sorry. And
No, the batteries run in.
oh, plug it back in, see if it all works.
Okay. So yeah, prior to seeing that, I was only going off of if you have the great book Rare Plants of Texas. There's this one photo in there of which was the only real living photo I had seen of tardifolia that really shows all that really dense hairiness on the undersides. And so that's what was always kind of jumping out to me, that tardifolia may be something distinct. I had found prior to that some of these gravesy eye looking things that did have a fair degree of hairiness on the undersides, but still just weren't convincing enough to me. Some of the thoughts are that that one or a couple species that had only been known up in the Chisos were maybe just some chance hybrids, being that oaks are wind pollinated, and there's just such a high diversity of oaks in the Sierra del Carmen's, only 30 miles away from the Chisos, that sometimes some pollen may come up from other species and may just happen to land on a female flower in the Chisos and create a hybrid that may not necessarily amount to a stable reproductive population. But some people had thought that Quercus coholensis, the one on the left there might be one of the pollen parents, just because it's got the white fuzzy underside. The leaves are obviously different, but mixed with Gravesii, it could maybe take on that form that we saw on the previous slide. And then other people thought Quercus hypoxantha, but the closest naturally known individuals, these are just so far away that it's so unlikely that pollen would be blown up this far. And so, yeah, there's just a lot going on. We're actually in May, we're going to be for Tardifolia specifically, we're doing a survey, just a real thorough survey of Boot Canyon and Juniper Canyon, just because to our knowledge, nobody's ever really taken the time just looking to see if there are some remaining specimens up there, if it was a good species that was maybe stable at one point that just got whittled down to this little relictual population in those cool, moist conditions up there. So it'd be neat to see if we can rediscover it alive up there. None of us really have our hopes up, but I guess it's better to stay positive with stuff like that. But yeah, throughout the West Texas, it just kind of, I'd made this kind of map showing just a lot of the red oak problems by region. So like up in the Davis Mountains, we see a lot less hybridization than we see going on down in the Chisos between the red oaks specifically. It seems like everybody tends to play nicely up there for whatever reason. You can find some hybrids to some degree, but down in the Chisos, it's just a total mess down there. And then once you get up into like the Glass Mountains here, you get these things that have just been considered Gravesii, just maybe based on their overall shape and form, but they grow in limestone, which we know from cultivation, especially from a lot of the earlier plantsmen, people have collected Gravesii from both the limestone areas and the igneous soils and grown them in places like Austin, San Antonio, and have realized that the ones that are growing on the igneous soils just don't like the limestone conditions in the Austin area. They'll just be chlorotic, they'll be yellow and stressed and obviously just not happy, whereas the ones on the limestone obviously will favor limestone in other regions there. So that may say something. And so that'll be interesting to see if we have two different potential species there. The ones up in the Glass Mountains tend to grow a lot more exposed than the ones in the other mountain ranges, where they tend to be in more sheltered, moist canyons. And then we have these things that have just always been called the Langtree oaks, just because some were collected near Langtree, but they're all actually all around, from like around Del Rio all the way around to eastern Brewster County there along the river in the limestone areas that tend to look like some of these things we're seeing in the Glass Mountains too. And a lot of people still just slap the name Gravesii on them for now, but these are the ones in the Glass Mountains. They tend to be a lot more, have longer lobes, are definitely exceptions, get the more asymmetric lobing on them too, but they'll just be grown on these just kind of open ranges, which is how you wouldn't normally find Gravesii in typical conditions. This is one of the Langtree oaks that Benny Simpson collected a long time ago, growing up in Dallas. Tends to have that kind of stretched leaf that some might interpret as graciliformis. But when we get into the population, these are some in Seminole Canyon State Park that we went and collected DNA from a year ago. Basically how they're growing, they're kind of tucked away in these areas where there is a spring upwelling from these rock faces here. So it is a little bit more moist. And you start seeing all these kind of interesting leaf forms that to me just stick out as very different than anything you'd see in the Chisos or elsewhere. High degree of variability. Some of them, like these, almost remind me of like some of the Quercus bucklei like you'd see in the Edwards Plateau. This one's maybe getting a little bit more Gravesii looking, so it could be a mix of genetics there. Get all these weird things. These actually kind of resemble a species in Mexico, like in Nuevo Leon, called Quercus halapensis. which we've been interested to see how these compare with those. Oops. But since we just skipped over the Buckley, it doesn't quite range into the Edwards Plateau or the Trans-Pecos area. It's mostly Edwards Plateau species. But going back to just potential new discoveries, this is up in the Davis Mountains along the Olympia Chutes Trail. We found this a little over a year ago, and just stuck out like a sore thumb to me. At first, just seeing the leaves, it just looked kind of like the Quercus rugosa at first, a little bit toothier. But then you flip the leaves over, and it's bright white underside, like a Hypoleucoides. And there are Hypoleucoides nearby, so then we're starting to think of what it may be hybridized with, but there's really no other white oaks we were thinking of until we started looking towards Mexico. And there is a species, Quercus sideroxyla, which is these two photos here taken in Mexico here, that this really seems to be spot on for, even down to the arrangement of the hairs and everything. So whether or not that's we really need to look around more up in the Davis Mountains just to see if there's more individuals of that around, or basically what that is. Maybe it is just some weird mutant Hypoleucoides. But we'll have the DNA results too. So we have all these mysteries I think we've already gone over here that we're looking to answer with our molecular work. This is some of our team here when we were collecting, and this is Marianne Renault. She's a journalist that came along with us. We put her to work making herbarium specimens, but she wrote a really great article in the New Republic, mostly focused on Quercus tardifolia, but also more broadly with our work and trying to understand these things. And definitely recommend looking up that article. And so this is back in the evening when we're pressing all of our herbarium specimens. We have these towers of sheets. Each one has these press specimens that correspond with our DNA samples that we keep on ice, basically. And using Andrew Hippies, the guy doing all the molecular work up at Morton Arboretum there, is to help press them. And then we get to take our album cover picture and Toyota advertisement with at the end of our trip here. And then just lightly touching on conservation will be done here. It's been kind of recognized these are our kind of priority targets, all of which we've already talked about. Not that there aren't other ones out here in West Texas, but with our Global Conservation Consortium for Oaks, these are the species that we're focused on. We have a couple grants. This one here is for Quercus depressivis Hinckley and graciliformis that Michael and I have been working with Roderick Kamen from Arboretum Grigadale in Argentina. And so as a result of that, we've been collecting, these are all root suckers of the Quercus hinkley that are all set up under mist propagation. So basically we'll treat them like a cutting. If you're familiar with vegetative cuttings, we'll dip them in rooting hormone and get them to root. Most of these are rooted now. And these are some of the Quercus depressivis from that one little population up on top of Mount Livermore. They look pretty pathetic at the moment here, but they'll be slowly establishing and growing out here. And we'll distribute these clones to other botanical gardens to get them backed up at multiple places, so we don't have all of our eggs in one basket. But we've got a lot of people helping out here, and probably missed a lot of people on this list here, but this is basically an international crew of people that are focused on helping understand and preserve our West Texas oaks. They are kind of in the spotlight here. So something to be proud of, and living among them here, and maybe inspire you to go learn more about them. So hopefully that's eased your confusion, yet made you confused in other areas here, but at least gives you a little bit more confidence to, if you have a willingness to immerse yourself in them and understand them better. Hopefully giving you some ideas to make it a little less painful. But again, just don't agonize over assigning a species to everything you see. It does not need to happen. So, thank you. And unless you have any questions to my whirlwind talk there?
At what elevation do the oaks finally quit growing? Repeat that question.
Yeah. So the question is, what elevation do they top out at? And basically, they will get to our highest peaks in the Trans-Pecos. So it depends on the species, of course. Some species will only be found at those highest elevations, and other ones like Quercus gricia can be found from low to the highest elevations. So it all really depends. And of course, the soil factors in too, whether it's limestone or rhyolite. So, anybody else? Yes. I don't know. I know they're looking at several genes, but I wouldn't be able to spit them out right now. The question was what molecular techniques they're using. I mean, we're definitely generating, doing some DNA extractions and look. Basically, they've Andrew Hipp would be the one to ask about that. He's the one who has perfected a lot of these means for separating out a lot of oak species around the world. So it's just basically building upon that, and there may be some adjustments as they go along here. Oh yeah, that's the plan. Assuming, yeah, I don't know yet. We're just starting, so I don't know if that's been determined yet. Well, yeah, I mean,
Just repeat the question.
yeah, as far as the time frame for the molecular work, we haven't even done the initial. I think they just got the extractions done, and they're going to be running them here soon. So doing the sequencing. So we're basically going to use that as a starting point to be able to know what else we want to collect to be able to fill in any gaps that may result from those initial collections. And we still have some additional samples sites we haven't got to yet that have some key species we want to get material from. So we're really in the early stages. It's going to be a bit down the road before we're close to having any sort of could make any sense of these, if it's all possible. Anybody else?
And there's a couple of questions from.
Okay, so will the DNA studies be able to determine whether Graciliformis and Gravesii are distinct species? We hope. Who knows? We may have other surprises that basically steer us away from the whole Gravesii Graciliformis concept. I mean, it's really hard to say what we're going to see there, but yeah, I mean, broadly, the whole point is to look at the big picture rather than try to look at on a species level and try to make our past described species work that have all been based more on the appearance and morphology rather than the genetics. Okay, so when I purchase oak trees at the Alpine Garden store to plant in Fort Davis, am I potentially contaminating the local oaks? It's an interesting question. And yeah, I mean, I guess that's possible. I mean, if they're native species, we don't know where they came from. I mean, I don't really know the sources. Mike would probably know better where a lot of the things come from in the local nursery trade here, but I know things like, I mean, a good example in Texas is in East and Central Texas. If you go to a nursery in Austin or San Antonio and pick up a quote unquote live oak, this is where common names kind of confuse things. You're going to get Quercus virginiana, which is not the native live oak, Quercus fusiformis in that region. And basically all those live oaks are trucked in from Florida. And basically there's like no nurseries that are actually growing Texas source live oaks, either the virginiana from East Texas or fusiformis from Central Texas. They're all brought in from Florida. So anything you see in a landscape, it was not produced here initially. It's all Eastern US provenance, either Louisiana or Florida, but Florida almost always. So it's one of those things we've been trying to encourage nurseries to grow more local source things because even though it may not seem like it matters and the trees may still grow, it may still on an ecological level matter, not just from them mixing with our native species, but also just the interactions with the wildlife and the ecology there. So it's just a whole area we just really don't know. But in the meantime, I mean, we're really limited with what we can get. And then also the oak trees seem to grow together in cluster, but planting instructions recommend to plant them 25 feet apart. Is that reasonable? It really depends on the species. I mean, the clusters are usually when you see a cluster, that's one plant. So that's kind of doing what it wants to do. It's not that these plants are all necessarily just kind of multiple individuals growing together. So they do space them out themselves out naturally, and they are competing with them with each other in nature. And sometimes one may overshadow or just outcompete the other one for resources. So yeah, it's definitely, if you want to have a healthy landscape and just maintain all your trees, it's definitely good to maintain those spaces between individuals. Another question is the hybridization that you see a natural phenomenon as part of evolution, or is this unwanted? Well, if it's going on in nature, I mean, it's just a totally natural thing. So it's what happens out there. People don't like it. People sometimes think that hybridization is just a bad thing and want to keep things pure, I guess maybe just to so it is easy to identify. But no, it's a totally natural process. This is how we get new species. This is how things adapt to changing times, and this is why nature will always defy our attempts to categorize it.
This is from Kevin Floyd, which you probably already mentioned this, just so everyone in Zoom hears it.
Oh yeah, yeah. So Michael, I, and several folks are actually coordinating our upcoming International Oak Society conference, which is held every 3 years somewhere in the world. And this year it was supposed to be in Taiwan, but just with COVID and everything, with a lot of the members being in the US, we decided to keep it in the US. I think Taiwan's actually shut down from allowing folks in. So this year it's going to be held in Las Cruces, so not far away. And if you're very serious in oaks, it's a great place to come mingle with experts and just amateurs alike. It's one of the better plant societies I know of in terms of a society that's focused on just one genus of plants. You really do get a lot of folks from around the world, a lot of great talks, a lot of alcohol in the evening, and got some great tours too. And Michael and I we're going to be leading a pre-conference tour, basically from San Antonio through the Edwards Plateau into the Trans-Pecos, and ultimately ending up in Las Cruces for the conference there. So it's going to be last week of August into the first week of September. It's right. Was it 4 days? The conference itself.
So I think it's
Something we should know.
August 24th or 5th in San Antonio. That's the pre-tour. But if you look for International Oak Society,
ios.org.
and there will be a post tour as well. But they'll be doing sort of more of the Western Arizona stuff. Pre-tour, then there'll be a post tour. All sorts of stuff.
Another question up: do the wasps that use the oaks as hosts hurt them? No, it's just some gall forming species form galls on the leaves. Other ones will actually form clusters of them on the stems, which can sometimes they can kill the tip of that stem. But generally, if the plant's healthy, they're just able to kind of shrug it off. It's just very localized damage, if that, or it may just be on a single leaf that's going to be shed off in another year or two anyway. So So yeah, no long-term effects. Another question, I live in Austin. I noticed a local Quercus texana in a nature preserve with ash juniper tend to spread their canopy, and then the trunks break off and die, which causes the area around them to have more sunlight. Pull it up. Okay, so let me start over. Notice the local Quercus texana, which just to clear that up now. So in Austin area, texana is kind of an old name, and they're now Quercus bucklei. The true Quercus texana is actually a species very sparingly found in East Texas that used to be Quercus natalii, and I'm totally confusing everybody now, I'm sure. But basically anything that used to be referred to as Quercus texana in Central Texas is now Quercus natalii, but still, most of the local Quercus texana / bucklei in a nature preserve with ash juniper tend to spread their canopy and trunks break and die, which cause the area around them to have more sunlight. Put on my glasses. I'm wondering if this is a trait that helps them from being crowded out by ash juniper and other trees, because the center of the tree tends to regrow. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the, I mean, if I understand what is being asked here, I mean, I've seen that with a lot of the oaks, not just the bucklei in Central Texas. It's a really harsh area, and a lot of these things just in bad times, especially times like the 2011 drought, where things were just really stressed. They oftentimes will just lose branches, and pieces will fall off, and then they'll grow back again. A lot of times oaks are not very wind resistant, so if we get like a windstorm come through, their major branches will be lost, but they do tend to regenerate. So I think when a lot of people, when they go out in the wild, they expect to see these big, beautiful symmetric oaks like we see in our landscapes here, because they're maintained as such. But in a natural area anywhere, I think, I mean, they're going to be kind of rangy, especially in areas that experience, again, either significant dry periods or just other environmental stress factors. They're just not going to look pretty in the wild there. So, but they're going to persist. I mean, if you see photos like other ancient trees, like some of the bristlecone pines that are totally gnarled up on these windswept mountain slopes and other things. I mean, half of them are sometimes dead, but it's just part of what they do. They're just adapted to survive, even if pieces are falling off them all the time.
And the only other question we had.
Nobody wants to see that. You can be my stand-in.
I'm gonna go ahead and
All right.
close out the computer in the back, but,
Yes.
All right, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording right now, and hopefully we'll have this available later on. Thanks for participating. Thanks for dealing with some of our issues. And again, hopefully we'll do another one here, not next month, but in May, I believe. We have Casey Williams, who's going to talk about the aquatic plants of West Texas. And so we'll just kind of, and Casey's actually behind me right there in that little video thing. So we had a few hiccups, but I think we were able to figure out some of the things that we're sort of dealing with. One, having two computers close to each other does not work. We can't use a microphone in this room because we get too much feed, or a speaker because we get too much feedback. And so we're kind of dealing with some stuff here and there, but we're trying to figure it out. So, but everyone, thanks for coming. And I think that should be it. Thank you.